June 1968, northern Michigan. A white sand shoreline, a stand of pines, a cedar-scented breeze, and a family that seemed to have it all. Richard Robison, an ad man turned publisher, and his wife Shirley brought their 4 children, teenage boys Richie, Gary, and Randy, and 7-year-old Susan, to their Good Heart cottage for a season of swimming, road trips, and quiet time far from the city grind. The place was called Somerset, and for a few perfect days it lived up to its name. Then the silence swallowed everything. Weeks later, a sickly smell rolled from the cottage, and the town's easy calm snapped. Inside, the entire Robison family lay dead. A handwritten note on the door, "Be back by 7 to 10, Robison," fluttered in the breeze like an invitation to look away. The crime scene would be mishandled, the evidence smudged, and the investigation would soon spiral through false leads and public confusion, without ever reaching a courtroom. Good Heart, once a postcard of summer, became shorthand for a mystery Michigan still can't shake. Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we pull apart the record, what's known, what's argued, and what most likely happened. Do you want to bring bad things with you wherever you go? Our episodes are now available as a podcast. Look us up on your favorite podcast app and listen to the most truth-seeking true crime podcast out there. Timeline. A prosperous family heads north. The Robisons began their drive north to Good Heart on June 16, 1968. Richard Robison, then 42, had built a thriving business called RC Associates, along with his arts magazine Impresario, which connected him to Detroit's advertising and cultural circles. The family's financial success allowed them a comfortable suburban life in Lathrop Village and summers at their cottage on Lake Michigan. That June, Richard planned to manage his business remotely while his employees kept the Detroit office running. Letters recovered later show that he intended to spend the summer balancing work and family time, a rare pause in his demanding schedule. When they arrived, the Robisons slipped easily into their familiar summer routine. The cedar-shingled cottage, which they called Somerset, sat among pines overlooking the lake. Friends remembered the family as the kind of neighbors you wave to from the dock. On one of their first days, Richard and Shirley visited caretaker Chauncey Bliss to offer condolences for the recent death of Bliss's teenage son. They were very kind, Bliss later recalled. They stopped in just to see how we were doing. The family's interactions with locals were unremarkable, friendly, ordinary, the way summers are supposed to begin. In those last known days, the Robisons ran errands in nearby Harbor Springs and enjoyed the quiet rhythm of Good Heart. They left short notes on the door for mail carriers about when they'd return, a casual habit that later took on chilling significance. On the afternoon of June 25th, several workers trimming trees nearby saw the family leaving the property in their car around 4:30 p.m. That same day, Richard placed a few phone calls to his Detroit office, checking on business affairs and discussing missing checks. One of those calls would be the final confirmed contact anyone had with the Robisons. The night of the murders. Investigators would later reconstruct the attack from the physical evidence left behind. Sometime after the family returned to the cottage that evening, someone approached the house from the wooded area behind it. 5 bullets from a .22 caliber rifle were fired through a rear window, striking Richard and possibly one of the boys. The shooter then entered through an unlocked door and used a .25 caliber pistol to kill the remaining family members at close range. Autopsy reports recorded multiple gunshot wounds to each victim's head and chest. Richard and 7-year-old Susan had also been struck with a hammer found inside the cottage. There were no signs of sexual assault or forced entry. Shirley's body, partially unclothed and positioned apart from the others, appeared to have been arranged deliberately, as though the killer wanted to mislead investigators into thinking robbery or assault had been involved. The living room bore traces of an uninterrupted domestic scene. A deck of cards, a knocked-over chair, an ashtray still half full. An expensive ring was missing from Shirley's finger, and the front room looked staged. Drawers pulled open, items scattered but nothing of real value taken. Near the hallway, investigators found a single bloody boot print. The impression suggested one perpetrator. Before leaving, the killer drew the curtains, taped cardboard over the bullet-riddled window, and turned on the cabin's heating system, despite the summer warmth. Experts believe this was intended to accelerate decomposition and mask the time of death. On the front door, a handwritten note appeared on a folded paper towel. "Be back by 7 to 10. Robison." The doors were locked. The grisly discovery. The Robison family remained undiscovered for nearly 4 weeks. In 1968, long-distance communication was limited and expensive. Friends assumed the family was on an extended road trip. Mail began to pile up. It wasn't until July 22nd that neighbors hosting a bridge party noticed an overwhelming smell drifting from the direction of Somerset. "At first we thought something had died under the porch," one neighbor told reporters. "But it was stronger, sour, heavy. It was something else." Caretaker Chauncey Bliss went to check. Finding the doors locked, he peered through a window and saw flies clustered thick against the glass. When he pried open the frame and climbed inside, he stopped almost immediately. "It was the worst thing I ever saw," he said later. The bodies of Richard, Shirley, Richie, Gary, Randy, and Susan lay where they had fallen. The summer heat had rendered them unrecognizable. Richard's body was in the hallway, with Randy's small frame draped across his chest. Susan lay nearby. Shirley was in the living room, covered by a blanket. Richie and Gary were found near the bedrooms. Bliss staggered outside and ran for help. Word spread fast. Within hours, police, reporters, and stunned residents gathered at the lakeshore. What had been a private retreat was now a public spectacle. A tainted crime scene. The investigation began in chaos. Emmett County Sheriff John Fleece was on his first vacation in 8 years, leaving his undersheriff temporarily in charge. By the time state police arrived, townspeople and journalists had already wandered through the cottage. "It was like a parade," one officer later said. "We couldn't keep them out." Fingerprints were smeared, footprints overlapped, and key pieces of evidence were moved or handled without gloves. Despite the contamination, investigators catalogued what they could. 15 shell casings, the blood-stained hammer, the note on the door, and the positions of the bodies. One deputy, in an effort to preserve the hammer, wiped it clean, an action that erased any latent prints. The heating system, still running when police entered, had warped wood and ruined trace evidence. Witness interviews began immediately. Several residents recalled hearing popping sounds or shouting near the Robison property around the evening of June 25th, but dismissed it at the time, assuming the boys were target shooting. No one reported seeing unfamiliar cars or strangers in the area. The investigation widens. As police searched for a motive, they began piecing together the Robisons' last weeks. Richard had spoken of business concerns and missing funds. He had recently written letters about auditing company accounts and straightening out a financial discrepancy. The family's travel plans suggested they intended to leave for Kentucky and Florida after June 25th, a trip that never happened. Detectives also looked for connections beyond Good Heart. Business partners, friends, former employees, or anyone who might have reason to harm the Robisons. Leads emerged from Detroit to Harbor Springs, producing more questions than answers. For months, investigators chased conflicting accounts, financial irregularities, and anonymous tips. A case without closure. By late 1969, a joint task force from Michigan State Police and the Emmett County Sheriff's Department compiled a 700-page report naming a single suspect based on motive, opportunity, and ballistic links. Yet crucial evidence, the murder weapons themselves, had never been recovered, and no witness could place anyone specific at Somerset that night. County prosecutors, facing political and financial pressure, decided there was not enough to take the case to trial. The decision left the community reeling. Locals had believed an arrest was imminent. Instead, the official stance shifted to silence. As one investigator later admitted, "We knew who we believed did it. We just couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt." Years of uncertainty. The Robison children were buried alongside their parents on July 26, 1968. The following spring, the family's cottage was demolished and the property cleared at the request of the estate. News of the murders faded from front pages, but never disappeared. For law enforcement, it became a cautionary tale of what happens when a crime scene is lost to haste and mishandling. Through the 1970s and beyond, new prosecutors periodically reopened the file, searching for the missing weapons or fresh witnesses. None surfaced. Michigan's open case policy meant the investigation could never be formally closed, and it remains active in name even now. For those who worked the case, the outcome was deeply unsatisfying. 6 lives ended, hundreds of clues examined, and still no day in court. The Goodhart murders entered state history not only as a tragedy, but as a study in investigative failure. A reminder that one missed fingerprint or one contaminated room can alter justice forever. Theories. Theory 1. The serial killer connection. Another school of thought tied the Robison case to a wave of killings that later gripped southeastern Michigan. In 1969, Eastern Michigan University student John Norman Collins was arrested for the so-called co-ed murders, a series of brutal slayings targeting young women. Some writers claimed Collins had once met one of the Robison boys and speculated that the Goodhart murders marked his first experiment with violence. The surface parallels were tempting. Use of blunt instruments, multiple gunshots, victims surprised in domestic settings. Yet forensic profiles told a different story. Collins's crimes featured sexual assault and strangulation, not execution-style shootings. He stalked college-age women, not families with children. Police records placed him hundreds of miles away at the time. Even investigators who kept the idea alive privately conceded that the overlap was more coincidence than connection. Theory number 2. The embezzling employee. In the months after the murders, investigators kept returning to a familiar name. Joseph "Sco" Scalaro, Richard Robison's 30-year-old office manager in Detroit. Scalaro had been left in charge of the family's advertising business while the Robisons spent the summer in Goodhart, a position that gave him access to company accounts, mail, and payroll. Colleagues described him as confident and restless, a man eager to prove himself. When auditors later uncovered irregularities in the books, suspicion naturally drifted toward the person who had been handling the money. Letters from Richard suggested growing frustration over missing checks and incorrect balances, and police soon discovered that Scalaro's schedule on June 25th, the day the Robisons vanished, was difficult to verify. He owned several firearms and was known to be an expert marksman, facts that drew attention once the murder weapons were identified. Yet for every lead that pointed toward him, there was another that clouded the picture. No fingerprints, no witnesses placing him near Goodhart, and no recovered gun that tied him directly to the scene. He fit, one detective said years later, but so did the gaps. To some, Scalaro was a nervous employee caught in an unfortunate coincidence. To others, he was a man with too much to lose and too many questions left unanswered. Theory 3. The caretaker's revenge. In a town that small, suspicion inevitably turned inward. Caretaker Chauncey Bliss had found the bodies and thus became, for some locals, the easiest person to imagine holding a hidden motive. Only weeks earlier, his teenage son had died in a motorcycle crash, and gossip suggested resentment toward outsiders living comfortably while he grieved. A few armchair detectives even argued that a $20 condolence note from Richard Robison might have felt insulting, provoking rage. Police examined the possibility and quickly dismissed it. Bliss voluntarily took polygraph tests and cooperated fully. No weapon or ammunition connected him to the scene, and he lacked the means or history of violence implied by the killings. "I couldn't hurt anybody," he told a reporter years later. "I just wish I'd never gone in that house." What survived of the caretaker theory is less evidence than folklore, a reflection of how grief breeds suspicion. Theory 4. Organized crime or business rivals. Because Richard Robison operated in Detroit's competitive advertising market, some speculated that the murders were a professional hit. The 1960s Midwest had seen occasional intersections of business, unions, and organized crime. Perhaps Robison had refused a deal or angered a client with mob connections. The staged robbery scene, missing jewelry, and multiple weapons could suggest professionals masking their work. Investigators chased that lead through bank statements and phone records but found no link to syndicates or rivals. Nothing else was stolen. The family car, cash, and valuables remained untouched. The ferocity toward the children also defied the detached style of contract killings. It was too sloppy for hired guns and too personal for business, one Michigan State Police sergeant later said. The organized crime angle faded as quickly as it appeared. Theory 5. The unknown accomplice. A handful of detectives, and later several true crime writers, floated a hybrid idea that the primary suspect did not act alone. Rumors surfaced of a man named Robert Matthews, allegedly a friend or associate who disappeared after 1968. A former prisoner reportedly boasted years later that he had helped kill the Robisons and that Matthews was the triggerman. The claim was never substantiated, no record of the confession remains, and Matthews himself was never located. Still, the notion of two perpetrators solved some puzzles. It explained how heavy weapons and ammunition could be transported unnoticed, how one person might control the family while the other staged the scene. Supporters of the theory argued that certain inconsistencies, the arrangement of bodies, the odd mixture of haste and planning, hinted at teamwork. Yet without physical proof or surviving witnesses, the alleged accomplice remains a ghost story within the larger mystery. Theory 6. The stranger in the woods. A smaller contingent of theorists insists the killer was neither friend nor colleague, but a drifter, hunter, or transient passing through northern Michigan's vast wilderness. The area's seasonal cabins stood empty for most of the year, and transient laborers sometimes camped nearby. Perhaps a stranger saw the Robisons arrive, waited until night, and struck. Proponents cite the randomness of the attack and the lack of theft as evidence of psychosis rather than motive. Local authorities found the theory unworkable. Roadblocks, fingerprint checks, and interviews with nearby camps produced nothing. No foreign tire tracks, no footprints other than the single boot print, and no unclaimed weapons surfaced. As one investigator summarized, "If a stranger did it, he left like a ghost and never made a ripple again." Weighing the theories. Across half a century of inquiry, every avenue circles back to one truth. Someone with knowledge of the Robisons' routines entered that cabin and erased an entire family in minutes. Each hypothesis captures a different facet of human possibility: greed, vengeance, madness, or organized calculation. But none delivers certainty. Police files lean toward the embezzlement motive. Skeptics hold out for a second man or an unknown wanderer. What remains undeniable is that the Goodhart case exposes the limits of evidence when time, contamination, and politics intervene. Theories abound, but proof never arrived. Only by dissecting each element, motive, opportunity, and method, can we approach the question that still haunts Michigan's shoreline. What most likely happened? What most likely happened? The simplest explanations are often the one that survives scrutiny. After decades of debate, document reviews, and half-confessions, the Goodhart murders keep returning to one man, Joseph Sco Scalaro, the trusted associate who stood at the intersection of opportunity, motive, and means. By the summer of 1968, Scalaro's career was quietly unraveling. As Richard Robison's office manager, he managed both RC Associates and Impresario, signing checks, approving payments, and overseeing the financial arteries of the business. Behind the polished exterior, auditors would later find a hole. More than $60,000 diverted into his own accounts. For months, he juggled forged signatures and duplicate ledgers, hoping the deception would go unnoticed. It didn't. In the days before the murders, Richard had begun asking pointed questions. Witnesses recalled phone calls where he sounded frustrated and terse. He was starting to put it together, one colleague later told police. On June 25th, Richard made another call to Detroit, his last recorded communication. That same morning, Scalaro left the office around 10:30 a.m. and disappeared for roughly 12 hours. The timeline fits with unnerving precision. The drive from suburban Detroit to Goodhart is nearly 6 hours each way. Scalaro could have left the city late morning, arrived at the Robison cottage before dusk, and returned to Detroit before sunrise. No one saw him make the trip, but no one could confirm that he didn't. The evidence inside Somerset tells the rest of the story. The killer arrived familiar enough that the family felt no alarm. Richard may have been seated near the rear window, where 5 .22 caliber bullets later pierced the glass. Those shots, investigators determined, came from an AR-7 rifle, a model Scalaro had purchased months earlier. After Richard fell, the shooter entered the cottage and used a .25 caliber pistol to kill the rest of the family. Richard and little Susan suffered additional blows from a claw hammer, a moment of violence that felt personal rather than procedural. There was no forced entry, no valuables were taken. Shirley's body was partially unclothed, seemingly to suggest sexual assault, yet the autopsy ruled it out. The scene was staged, but sloppily, the work of someone intelligent enough to imitate a robbery, yet impulsive enough to leave a footprint and 15 shell casings behind. Ballistics work later confirmed that the casings found in the cottage matched test shells recovered at a private firing range owned by Scalaro's father-in-law. The unique extractor marks aligned perfectly. Investigators also discovered that Scalaro owned 2 pairs of identical boots. One pair was missing, and the tread pattern of the remaining pair matched the print near the bodies. When questioned, he lied about the location of his guns, failed 2 polygraphs, and grew visibly agitated whenever auditors were mentioned. To police, the pattern was obvious. To prosecutors, it wasn't enough. No murder weapons, no eyewitness, no confession. Just a chain of evidence that felt ironclad, yet remained circumstantial. We could build the picture, one detective said later, but not the frame. Politics and budget pressures made the decision easier. Without a guaranteed conviction, the case was shelved. Scalaro, meanwhile, continued to present himself as a victim of misunderstanding. He wrote apologetic letters about his accounting mistakes, blamed stress, and told friends that investigators were out to ruin him. Yet his life was fracturing under the weight of exposure. By 1973, when prosecutors prepared to reopen the case and bring formal charges, word reached him before the paperwork did. On March 8th of that year, Joseph Sco Scalaro was found dead in his Southfield office, a .25 caliber Beretta, the same model used in the murders, lying beside him. He left a typewritten note admitting to fraud and forgery, followed by a handwritten postscript. P.S. I had nothing to do with the Robisons. I'm a cheat, but not a murderer. To investigators who had chased him for years, that final line read like the last lie of a man who could no longer manage the truth. This effectively ended the case. No trial, no verdict, only an open file that would never close. For Michigan State Police, it was closure by elimination. Every alternative theory had collapsed under scrutiny. The caretaker had no motive. The serial killer was hundreds of miles away. The stranger in the woods was pure fantasy. Only Scalaro's timeline, access, and financial desperation aligned with every fact that survived the contamination of the crime scene. Occam's razor leaves little room for romantic theories. The simplest reconstruction is also the bleakest. A trusted employee, facing exposure and ruin, drove north to confront his employer, panicked, and killed an entire family to cover his deceit. He staged the house to delay discovery, locked the doors, left a note, and returned to Detroit as though nothing had happened. When new prosecutors finally moved to charge him 5 years later, Scalaro ended it instead. His death prevented a trial, but not a conclusion. "He was our man," retired Detective John Fleece told reporters decades later. "He had the motive, the guns, the knowledge, and in the end, he proved it by what he did." In the years since, the Goodhart murders have become both legend and warning. The demolished cottage, the note on the door, the name that still echoes in true crime circles, all stand as symbols of how fragile justice can be when evidence is lost and timing misfires. The mystery lingers, but the logic has hardened into something close to certainty. Standing where Somerset once stood, it's easy to imagine the Robisons laughing under the same sky, unaware that their trusted colleague was already driving north. The wind off Lake Michigan carries no answers, only the reminder that the distance between friendship and betrayal can sometimes be measured in miles and in bullets.